Okay, perfect. So thank you so much for joining us for this RelTalks. RelTalks is a series sponsored by Relevate, which is a multidisciplinary team of researchers and practitioners dedicated to increasing research on relationships. This is our second to last presentation for the semester. Our presenter tonight is Stylianos Syropoulos, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is part of the Psychology of Peace and Violence program. His research focuses on how close relationships influence subjective perceptions of safety, and how the presence or absence of safety in our lives influences our physical and mental health. His analytical method primarily relies on quantitative analysis, including multi-level and structural equation models. Stelios, share your screen and take it away.
Thank you. And thanks for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for attending. So today I'll be talking to you about some of the work and the applications that I've done while at UMass Amherst. But before I dive into it, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I became involved with research on safety. So as my long last name and my accent clearly identifies, I am an international student originally from Greece. And as with a lot of countries in the world, we have our own issues. And one of the biggest ones in recent years was the presence and absence of police forces in universities. A lot of people, police forces were not allowed to enter university campuses, and that led to a lot of crime and a lot of anarchy and disorder, as you can clearly see illustrated here from the University of Thessaloniki. However, even when police were allowed to enter eventually, that did not necessarily resolve all issues because there was not a lot of trust between administration and students. The environment was also not safe as well. And also there was not a lot of communication between police forces guarding the university and students. And that's something that I lived with as I was growing up and before I came to study in the US. And that's kind of my original confrontation with safety, which then coming here to the US was expanded on when I was exposed to all these different societal events that took place in the last few years. And all of these made to me clear that safety is a very important factor that has been understudied and needs to be emphasized in order for us to be able to address some of these issues portrayed here. However, when we're talking about safety, it's not necessarily clear what we are talking about. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what type of safety I'm interested in specifically and why it is important. So how some researchers have defined safety draws on the definition of peace. So Johan Galtung is one of the fathers of peace research, and he defined peace as not just the absence of violence, what he called negative peace, negative because something is reduced and removed, which is violence in this case, but also as the presence of factors such as social justice, equality, and fairness that promote peace, what he termed positive peace. Positive because you're adding something. And in the same manner, what I am interested in is the sense of safety that is not just the absence of threat, but also the presence of different circumstances in one's life, such as meaningful relationships or the ability to flourish, that actually define peace. And such a definition is also in line with more humanistic approaches, humanistic psychology approaches. So Abraham Maslow and his theory around our hierarchy of needs specifies that in order for us to reach self-actualization and live to our fullest potential, we first need to satisfy more basic needs, such as the need for shelter or the need for safety. That is not necessarily the case, as there's other research that suggests that the relationships direction is not does not only go one way, but it can actually have mutual influences. So how safe we feel can influence how we approach our relationships, or how much we value ourselves, or how much we feel we have reached our fullest potential. But our relationships can also influence how safe we feel. And finally, another way that I approach safety is through what is called social safety theory, which was pioneered by Slavich. In this argument, Slavich states that how safe we feel in one specific social sphere, so as a person, within our family, in the context of our friends, our community, and going on to larger and larger spheres, is influencing how safe we feel in each of these different spheres of existence. And that, similarly to the research I outlined earlier, this is not a unidirectional association, but rather an association that exists on both ends. So how safe we feel in a specific region might influence, again, how we view our relationships and vice versa. So with that in mind, what does it mean to feel safe? And here is where I will not actually attempt to give an objective definition, but rather a subjective one. Safety is something that directly depends on the individual. Some factors that make us feel safe differ from one person to the other. For example, a very unstressful situation to me, like, I don't know, the lights being out in my room, can be perfectly normal to me. But for a person who is afraid of the dark, that might be a very stressful situation and make them feel unsafe. And there's a million of other examples like this. And this is particularly the case for safety within relationships, or what is called relational safety. And this aspect of how safe we feel, so how safe we feel around other people in our relationships, can then go on to influence how we function as people in other spheres, based on the findings I talked about earlier. So at this point, I want us to reflect for a second and think about how safe we feel currently. Do you feel safe in your life in general? Are there any factors that have caused you to experience any sort of distress? What about your workplace? Are there any individuals or behaviors or factors in the workplace itself, in the environment where you work, that are causes for concern? And finally, what about your close relationships, be it with your significant other, your parents, or any sort of close relationship with friends? Are there any behaviors or any environments where you feel unsafe? And why is it important to feel safe in those environments? So, in this part of the talk, I'm going to emphasize why building meaningful relationships is important into helping us ensuring that we feel safe, and what are the downstream consequences of feeling safe. We know that better relationship quality has been established as an antecedent of increased relational safety and how safe we feel in our lives in general. If we are supported by individuals who we cherish in our lives, that tends to increase how safe we feel, which then also has numerous benefits that I will describe in a sec. In addition, there's also a lot of evidence that suggests that the absence of conflict in relationships, as well as the absence of intimate partner violence specifically, also relates to increased relational safety. But what are the consequences of feeling safe or unsafe? So those are pretty clear. There's been a lot of research, not just by me, but a lot of other researchers as well, that highlights that those who report greater feelings of safety in their relationships, as well as in general, are also living healthier lives, primarily because they are able to venture out and go out into the world, engage in more social activities, and therefore, being able to stay in better shape, as well as have more meaningful interactions with other people. In turn, those who experience greater levels of safety in their lives are also able to cope with stressful situations in a more constructive way, because they're not cognitively taxed and they have more resources available to deal with these situations when they emerge. That is why there's also research suggesting that those who actually feel unsafe and experience a lot of stressors in their lives also tend to report greater levels of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and distress in general. So overall, there's a lot of research that suggests that making sure that we feel safe in our relationships, in our working environment, and in our lives in general, across all these spheres, is an important antecedent of living a happy and flourishing life. But what are some ways that we can improve upon our close relationships specifically in order to ensure that we feel safe and therefore are able to reap the benefits of having a safe existence? So the first and biggest recommendation is to ensure that there is no violence at all stages of life. Minimizing conflict, and violence, whether that is physical, verbal, or mental, is key. And there's a lot of research to suggest that this is especially important at earlier stages of development. Second, it is important to emphasize high quality rather than high quantity of relationships. Although having multiple people that one can turn to is important, having one person that at the very least knows that you're in trouble and knows how to approach you is even more crucial. And building off of this last point, we know that there are a lot of ways that we can build and actively work on to maintain high quality relationships. And in my opinion, one of the most important ways that we can build and establish meaningful relationships is through communication. We know that by communicating effectively with a close partner, we can get our point across and avoid conflict. But how do we go about communicating with someone, especially when the situation is really tense? So one way is to engage in perspective taking. As you see clearly here, for some people, this number is a 6, for others it's a 9. And the only way you're able to understand each other person's point of view is to actually take a step back and try to think, why is this person talking or thinking in the way they are? And by engaging in perspective taking, you'll be able to understand this, where the other person is coming from, and therefore be more likely to prevent using language or behaviors that might be offensive or deleterious for the particular situation. Another suggestion is to engage in forgiveness. There's a plethora of research that has shown that in relationships, either romantic or work relationships that are characterized by greater levels of forgiveness, they tend to be of higher quality and last longer. And when I'm talking about forgiveness, I mean understanding why a wrongful act was committed and trying to talk about how it can be prevented from happening again, as well as moving on from this wrongful act to maintaining the positive bond with another person. And finally, there are 2 additional ways that are pretty straightforward that can help establish and maintain meaningful relationships. The first one is simply spending quality time with a partner. I feel like all of us during COVID-19 had to shelter in specific places with or without a partner. And whether you spend time in person with someone or virtually through Zoom, as we're talking now, or any other platform, you understood that in order for you to have this meaningful relationship with someone, it is important to spend quality time with them. So that is another suggestion. And finally, one that is more, at least empirically driven, is having a gratitude journal in which you express the factors that and events in your day-to-day life, or in whatever frequency you are able to engage in this gratitude journal, and with regards to the things that you're grateful for in this relationship. Maybe it's a gesture. Maybe it is something that your partner said. Regardless, just expressing this act, this expressing gratitude towards someone can go a long way in maintaining a meaningful and high quality relationship. So with that in mind, that is the end of my talk. And I would like to take this time to thank the RelTalk team for inviting me here. I feel very honored to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about my work and how it potentially is useful outside of academia. I would also like to thank the Psychology of Peace and Violence program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst for all of the support, specifically the Family Relationship, Affective Science, and Minority Health Lab for helping me conduct this research and evaluate it, as well as PsychI, which is the International Honor Society in Psychology, and the Love Consortium, which is this very cool inter-organizational effort across across a whole range of researchers focusing on love and close relationships that promotes collaboration. So I want to acknowledge them for their help as well. Yeah.
There we go. Thank you so much for that, Stylianos. That was fantastic. So we're going to open up to everyone else for questions. So if you would, put your questions in the chat. And to get us started, what do we do if we don't feel safe in our relationships at all?
Yeah, that is a great question. The first suggestion I would have is ensuring whether this lack of safety is physical or if it's another type of absence of safety. Obviously, when we're talking about physical safety, the first and biggest concern is the well-being of the person who's in danger. And for better or for worse, not focusing on drawing from intimate partner violence research, we know that it's hard for somebody who's on the receiving end of such violence to withdraw from such a situation. So my recommendation would be to confide in a trusting friend. And that's why I'm saying meaningful relationships and high quality relationships are important. Reaching out to someone who you know has your back is key. Obviously, reaching out to the authorities if it's something that's physical is also important, but I can understand that sometimes that is hard to do, especially because you don't know the person you're reaching out to and whether they will hear you or what the consequences of that will be. So at the very least, reaching out to somebody who you know has your back is, in my opinion, the best way to approach this. But if we're talking about, relational safety in general, I would say take a step back and try to think about what are the factors that are causing this distress. And if you can then have a civilized conversation with the person who is causing the distress and making your points across and ensuring that you're being heard is the best way forward. And that will not always be the case. And that person might not be interested in hearing out. And in that case, I don't know what you can do other than just making yourself heard and just withdrawing from the situation or the relationship, because if that person doesn't value you and you feel unsafe near them, you can't have a meaningful relationship with them.
Yeah. So safety really contributing to being able to have a meaningful relationship with someone else.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about, you mentioned a couple things that we can do to help make our relationships feel safer. Do you have any other recommendations that maybe didn't fit in the time frame of the presentation?
Yeah, well, one thing I will say about relational safety in particular is intimacy. Being able to open up to a partner is key and has been tied to a whole range of positive outcomes in relationships. So being intimate with a partner when that relationship, is either a friendship or a romantic relationship. Outside those types of relationships, I would say respect and establishing establishing specific norms about what is acceptable and what behaviors make you feel safe or unsafe is another important factor. So making clear that, for example, cursing, or when somebody raises your voice, when somebody raises their voice, that can be very distressful to you because of X and Y reasons. There's also another way, another important, I think, intervention, setting up those boundaries.
Yeah, and we've got one question in the chat as well. Do you have any suggestions for how I can help people around me feel safe in work relationships?
Yeah, that is a great question. So first and foremost, creating a welcoming environment. There's research that talks about lighting, scent, and just like behavior in an environment that can establish an environment that is more welcoming and therefore more safe. So my first approach would be create the environment you want to work in. Second is building a network of trusted individuals that you can confide in. It's hard to confront someone when it's just a one-on-one conversation, especially when that other person that is causing you to feel unsafe is higher in power. But when there's multiple voices expressing the same concern, or being aware of a situation occurring, that can actively help prevent it from occurring again. So those would be my two recommendations. One more, environmentally focused, one more focusing on relationships.
Those are great. Does anyone else from the audience have questions? Here we go. How do you put forgiveness into place after boundaries are broken?
That is a great question. And, for this one, this is also coming from my personal experience. I am also dating somebody who is a social psychologist, and, we're both aware of the research, yet we both sometimes, when life happens, break each other's boundaries and end up fighting. Even though we're both aware of what not to do. So such situations will occur. And I think approaching forgiveness in this context first requires understanding your own limitations and being compassionate to yourself, and then requires understanding the context in which these boundaries were broken and why they were broken. And that requires perspective taking, as I've said earlier, taking a step back and understanding where the other person came from and why they expressed in the way they did. So whether you would forgive them or not depends on the severity of the behavior that violated this boundary or this norm. But as long as you, as an agent, can make that can make the judgment that the other person did not intentionally meant to harm, and you're valuing this relationship and you want to continue, you can talk about figuring out a way, moving on forward, about how to best deal with this situation and actively work together to prevent it from happening again.
Stylianos, thank you so much for this talk. This has been insightful in terms of giving us some real things to think about and making our own relationships feel a lot safer. And so with that, we really appreciate you all showing up for this talk. It'll be posted here on YouTube very shortly. Thank you all for your involvement in this, and we'll see you hopefully at the next RelTalk.